people ask why we are working with leather, if leather has this connection with such environmental impacts. FAO estimated that cattle herds will increase at least by 20% until 2050 to deal with the growth of the population. So it's about how can we make sure that when they are growing, we can make them more efficient, and we can ensure that they are not impacting the environment.
Welcome to Nature Breaking, a World Wildlife Fund podcast focused on the news and trends affecting our natural world and the people and species who call it home. I'm Seth Larson, and today we're going to be highlighting a new initiative aimed at reducing the environmental footprint of leather production. Leather, as we all know, is sourced from cattle. And right now, cattle ranching for both beef and leather production is a major driver of deforestation, particularly in key biomes like the Amazon, the Cerrado, and the Gran Chaco. In Brazil, for example, cattle ranching drives twice as much deforestation as the production of soy, palm oil, and wood products combined. It's a major problem that we need to overcome if we're going to save critical ecosystems, conserve species, and secure a stable future for our planet. That's where the Deforestation-Free Leather Fund comes in. This new initiative, launched by WWF in March, gives companies that use leather in their products a chance to make a difference. And today, I'll be interviewing the leader of that initiative, Fernando Bellezzi, about what exactly he hopes the initiative will achieve and how companies can get involved. Before I bring Fernando into this conversation, please like this episode on YouTube and subscribe to Nature Breaking wherever you're listening to this podcast. More likes and subscribes make a real difference with the algorithms on various platforms, which quite simply helps our show reach more people. Thank you for listening, and here's my interview with Fernando. Okay, I'm joined now by Fernando Bellezzi, Senior Director of Beef and Leather Supply Chains at WWF. Fernando, welcome to Nature Breaking.
Thank you very much, Seth. I'm glad to be here today.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're here also. And before we get started, I'd love for you to just tell us a little about your background and really what led to your work on making beef and leather supply chains more sustainable. I feel like this is a very specific field. I'd love to hear how you got into it.
Yes, it's an interesting question, and I'm happy to answer. Actually, I've been engaged in these two supply chains for just under 15 years, always working with sustainability in the beef and leather sectors, but trying to understand two different things. One is how those sectors they can be more efficient in a way of processing, making new things with those raw materials, but also looking at the supply chain, how we can work together with suppliers to make them more efficient, to make sure that they are abiding to law, following voluntary standards, and working more responsibly. I started in Brazil about just under 15 years ago, working for a food processing company. Since then, I moved to the US. I joined a Taiwanese group that works both making leather but also footwear. And through those experiences, I've always been engaged in different initiatives, talking to different organizations, discussing supply chain sector-wide issues. And through some of those discussions, I had the chance to collaborate with WWF here in the US. And after that, I was invited to join the markets team here at WWF in the US. And I'm, as you mentioned, I'm the senior director for beef and leather supply chains. And what we do here, we work with the private sector all the way from brands, retailers, going up to midstream processors, slaughterhouses, and producers to understand how we can drive efficiencies, but most importantly, how we can ensure those supply chains are free from deforestation and conversion of ecosystems.
Okay, yeah, thank you for giving us some of your background. It seems like you've had a lot of experience in different stages of the supply chain as it pertains to leather and food production. And I want to take advantage of some of your expertise here. And before we dive into the fund itself, can you just explain for our audience the difference between leather that's produced sustainably versus leather that's not? What do we mean when we use those terms, and what's the difference between them?
I can try. It's not a straightforward answer, and there are many things that you need to assess, you need to look at in order to make that judgment. But I think in leather, as in many supply chains, that there are two different and very important aspects that we need to look at. One is where those raw materials comes from, and
Hmm.
what are the practices involved with those with the sourcing of those raw materials. And the other part is how you process it.
Okay.
If you look specifically at leather is a resource intensive material. You need a lot of energy, water, chemicals to process it, to make it a good product. It tends to generate a lot of waste. So you need to ensure that those processes are maximized, that you are using clear production methods to ensure that you are driving those efficiencies within processing facilities. But there's also the impacts that comes from your supply chain. Leather is a byproduct of cattle production, and most of its impacts
Hmm.
comes from that sector. Just to give an idea, when we are performing life cycle assessments, between 60 to 80% of the impacts coming from the impact from leather comes from the life of the animal. So if you don't address that part, you are really not addressing the core issues. So we need to make sure that when you are sourcing from responsible areas, and you are helping to drive improvements in those sectors. And it's interesting because if you compare a leather that comes from deforested areas in comparison with those that comes from land that has not been changed, has not been converted recently,
Hmm.
the impacts are 11 times, sometimes up to 11 times higher. So it's really important that we look both the efficiency within a tannery manufacturer, but also what is happening in the supply chain.
And when you say when we assess the impacts, the impacts you're talking about is that everything from greenhouse gas emissions to forest loss to what are some of the other impacts? Are those the main two, or are there others that we're looking at also?
Those are some of the main impacts. Biodiversity is another one, but when you look at life cycle assessment, you are also looking at water usage, abiotic depletion. That there are a number of impacts that comes from the supply chain, and you need to make sure you are addressing them all.
Gotcha. So just to sort of summarize that, it sounds like there's a variety of impacts that can happen sort of in the production phase when leather is actually being produced and it's in a factory setting, and you're dealing with materials there, turning them into products. But there's also impacts from the life cycle of the cattle that are used to produce that leather, and that's where the bulk of the impacts come from, and that's really what we're trying to address through this fund, right?
That's correct. You summarized it perfectly.
Okay, good. I appreciate it. So let's talk about that fund. I want to get into the details of it in a minute, but before we do that, I wanted to just ask why a fund is needed to address this problem of sustainability with leather.
Yeah, we it's before I answer that question, it's important to share that we've been working in different commodities, understanding the impact of producing those commodities in the environment, and how we could be addressing them together with the private sector. Beef is one of them, and after a few years, we understood that leather was an important part of that equation, because it comes from the same supply chain. It comes from cattle production. So we thought it was important to also work with companies in that sector. But when we started working on that sector, we understood that they have some very specific characteristics. On one side, they are like, if you look at the part that is closer to consumers, they are made of a lot of large companies, international brands, retailers, which you see them often they are engaged in important discussions related to sustainability. They are trying to engage their supply chain. So it's a good door to start some discussions and to start to promote some change. Having said that, when you look on the upstream side, so the side that's closer to producers, closer to slaughterhouses, that sector represents a very small amount of the total business that's generated. To give you an example, uh, when you look at the slaughterhouse, the amount of money they make from selling the hides in South America, which is where the fund is going to be looking to support projects, the hide sold by the hide that's going to be, it's the raw material that's going to become leather, when it represents at most 1% of the total revenue from the slaughterhouse. So even though,
Really?
yeah, it's
Huh.
incredible, isn't it? So even considering the size of the companies, the international brands, we know when they start engaging with slaughterhouses and producers, they have very limited leverage. So what we decided was that, okay, they may not be able to move at the strength and speed they need by themselves, but if they can work together, first we can send a stronger signal, but making sure that also the support they channel in the supply chain, they are used in a meaningful way, and by using it collectively, they bring better results. So like in a summary, that's the idea behind the fund.
Gotcha. I have just a quick question that I thought of as you were talking, that it occurred to me I don't know the answer to, and I'm inferring an answer based on what you've said, but I don't know this to be true. Is Are most cattle that are raised for beef production, are their hides then usually sold for leather production, or do they tend to be separate animals that are used for beef versus leather?
That's a very important question, Seth, because it's also part of why we need to engage with that sector. There is no cattle that is raised for leather. Cattle
Yeah,
is raised for beef, and leather is a byproduct of that
yeah,
sector.
interesting.
Saying that doesn't mean that the leather sector doesn't, it's not co-responsible for that. The leather sector has to engage with that, but because the main motivation behind cattle raising is beef, we need to understand that not only companies in the leather sector cannot solve everything by themselves, they need to
Hmm.
work collectively within the leather sector, but they also need to work with the beef sector to address the problem. If you give me an extra minute just to
Please, yeah.
go a bit more in depth on this topic, this is also an interesting discussion that moving a bit away from the fund, but we are always engaged, often engaged in that discussion. People ask why we are working with leather, if leather has this connection with such environmental impacts. What we
Yeah.
see is that for the next 20 years, the world will increase the production of beef. FAO estimated that cattle herds will increase at least by 20% until 2050 to deal with the growth of the population. So it's not about having or not those sectors, it's about how can we make sure that when they are growing, we can make them more efficient, and we can ensure that they are not impacting the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important point, and I really want to thank you for making it because, yeah, like you said, it's not about whether those sectors will be there or not. It's about acknowledging that the projections are what they are, and we also know that those industries are driving deforestation, and that there's better ways to do things and worse ways to do things, and we're trying to encourage the best possible, most sustainable, most efficient practices we can, based on those future projections. So I think that's a great pivot point to get into talking a bit about the design of this fund, and how it will actually work and how it will actually drive change. So the Deforestation Free Leather Fund, my understanding is it's going to be focusing on three main tactics to help leather production become more sustainable. Those three tactics are traceability, ranching practices, and helping ranchers comply with laws and standards. I want to take each of those one at a time, and I think we should start with traceability. Can you just tell us what traceability means in this context and why it's important?
Yes, I can. When like traceability in a simple matter, it means you are able to understand where the materials you are using, the products you are buying, they come from,
Hmm.
and what is happening in those supply chains. It sounds simple, easy, but sometimes it can get very complicated. When you look at leather, sometimes even within just the leather processing facilities, that can be very complicated because you use different materials, different grades, different qualities, you use traders, so it can be complicated. But when you start looking to what happens after the slaughterhouse, moving towards producers, it gets way more complicated. Cattle, differently from other commodities like soy or cocoa, they move, they go from one farm to another. It's not uncommon to see one animal between the farm they were born and the day they were slaughtered to go through 3 4 different farms.
Hmm.
And that movement between farms make it very hard to trace those animals all the way to the farm of birth, because looking at environmental impact, the environmental impact doesn't happen also only on the direct supplier selling to the slaughterhouse. It happens on every single farm. So we need to
Yeah.
make sure we are looking at each of those farms. Not only that, most of the countries where you have larger cattle herds and leather being shipped, being exported, traceability is not mandatory. So you need to work with producers to get that information.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah, and so just I guess as an example, so maybe a production facility, a slaughterhouse might purchase a an animal from one farm that is deemed to be not associated with deforestation, but little do they know that that animal was born on a different farm that was in an area that was deforested, and it just happened to be sold to a farm that wasn't before it was processed. And so it's kind of we're trying to get to the beginning of that so that we have visibility about what's really true and where did this animal really come from and what impacts might be associated with its whole life, right?
that's perfect explanation. I think I can see you've done your homework, and that's the reality. Most often, the connection between the slaughterhouse and this first supplier, it's easier to deal with, and slaughterhouses in many geographies, they are able to monitor those suppliers in an efficient way to understand if there was deforestation, if there was conversion of ecosystems, but even for other things such as animal welfare. But the challenge is really how to do the same thing throughout the supply chain up to the farm of birth. And but there are solutions. That's the good thing. There are solutions. It's not only about technology, but it's related to the market arrangements, how farmers uh, have relationship with different suppliers. It's about incentives. We need to understand that very often we are asking producers to provide more information, to work more to provide that information, to make investments, but slaughterhouses, they are not paying for that. So we need to sometimes look at the market arrangements also to be able to do that. And the fund, when going back to your question, the
Yeah.
fund is going to look at basically two things: how we can help to scale some of those solutions for traceability, so to ensure that we are scaling some initiatives that have been created to individually trace the animal and be sure to monitor the life of those animals to prove that they are not coming from deforested areas or areas that were involved in other sort of environmental degradation. As a goal, for the first 3 years, we expect to individually trace and verify where those animals went through during their lives for at least 1 million heads of cattle. That's our
Hmm.
goal related to traceability.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. That would be hugely impactful, and I think that makes a lot of sense, and I can really see the line of how that connects to driving more sustainable practices. I want to ask you next about the second of these areas that the fund's going to be working in, which is ranching practices. And I wanted to just understand what practices in particular we are advocating for and how those practices would actually lead to better outcomes for nature.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. There are different if we look from the deforestation angle, there are different reasons why a producer, a farmer will deforest. But one that it's very common is that they are deforesting to increase their production. This can be done illegally, but very often it's also done legally.
Hmm.
So what we are trying to achieve with this part of the fund is to really help farmers to become more productive, to become more efficient, so they can produce more, they can be more profitable without needing to clear more land. Sometimes clearing land, deforesting, it's expensive as well. So if we are able to help them to become more profitable and more efficient without clearing land, we reduce that driver. So in terms of practice that we are going to support, it's about how farmers they can better manage pastures, how they can work with rotations, how they can use they can recover areas that have been degraded. Why do you need to deforest if you have an area that has been cleared before and it's just degraded? So it's really addressing the drivers for deforestation, so they can, it's about their livelihoods also. In the end, we need to make sure that they are working in balance with the environment, but that they are ensuring that their livelihoods, that they are achieving a good life. Let's put this way. So
Yeah.
these are the kind of practices we are talking about, and it's not very challenging. Just to give an example, in Brazil, where we first gonna start the fund, today on average a farmer raises one cattle of head per hectare, which is a very low production rate. In
Yeah.
some countries, you have two heads of cattle per hectare, and they are slaughtered at a younger age. So if we are able to get those farmers to go anywhere like close to two heads per hectare, if we are able to recover areas that are degraded, if we are able to send the animals to slaughterhouse at a younger age, sometimes the emissions, now talking specifically about greenhouse gases emissions, they can be up to 70% lower per kilo of beef or per
Wow.
kilo of leather. So it's a lot of impact that is reduced if we are able to drive that efficiency, those efficiencies.
Yeah, and I mean that makes a lot of sense too. I mean, if I'm a farmer and I have 500 cattle, but I see an opportunity and I want to increase my revenue and I want to have 700 cattle instead, it it seems like it would be a lot of work to clear more forest, cut down all those trees, and create a new space of land to have those cattle live in. If I can find ways to make the existing land that I already have work for more cattle, it's going to be an easier path for me as a farmer in this hypothetical scenario to increase my revenue with a little bit less just labor that would have to go into it and time. And I assume a lot of other factors as well.
And not only that, very often we create this negative image about farmers, but farmers they value their land, they value nature. We
Yeah.
just need to help them to understand how to become more efficient, how to work in a better way. Not only that, after you start having those discussions, they can see the positive impacts of respecting nature. When you are recovering the areas you deforested before, when you are recovering, for example, riparian areas, you see that the water cycles become more balanced again. You start having less extreme weathers. You become more resilient to droughts. So it's a win-win situation. You can, it allows them not only to become more profitable, but also they start seeing other positive effects coming from those better practices.
Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining that. And just to keep us moving, I want to touch on the last area that the fund is focused on, which is working with ranchers to help them comply with local production laws and voluntary standards so that they can gain access to legal leather markets. This one is just on its face a little more confusing to me. So I'd love for you to unpack it a little bit. What exactly are we helping ranchers to do? Why do they need our help to do it? And how will it lead to avoiding deforestation?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, but also probably one of the most complicated ones for people
Yeah.
who are not directly engaged on those discussions. And just to be clear, we are not talking only about becoming legal again, but also complying with other voluntary markets that sometimes farmers are non compliant for
Mm,
some reason. But what happens, Seth, is that very often when we start engaging with supply chains and when companies start to implementing some sort of sustainable responsible procurement approach, the first step they take is to start looking at their suppliers, monitor it to see if they are complying either with legal requirements or voluntary requirements, and they start sometimes blocking the non-compliant suppliers. This is one of the initial steps. But what we've seen through many years working in different sectors is that if you only block the low performing suppliers and you don't work in bring and helping to bring those suppliers back to compliance, what happens is that those suppliers will not cease to exist. Demand for beef, just as an example, it's higher than they offer, so they will find markets for those for beef
yeah.
for cattle and consequently for leather. And by leaving markets that are stricter and have higher requirements, they will start supplying to less strict markets which may not require those better practices. So
Yeah.
in a way it works against the conservation goals that we have. So it's
Interesting.
very important that we help those farmers to become compliant both legally and to voluntary markets, so they can access those better but more strict markets. and
Interesting.
but why do they need help?
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't know the right way of doing it. Some of the paths they need to follow are complicated. Sometimes they don't have the resources. It's expensive to restore areas that you have already deforested. Sometimes you have to fence that area. There are very clear steps that you can follow, both to go back to legal compliance, but also to follow some of those voluntary markets. But it's not necessarily an easy path to follow. So what we are trying with the fund is to really support the smaller, the small and medium farmers to be able to go through that journey of improvement. And just to and one
That's
thing I
great.
was forgetting before you move on, the positive results coming from this process are very interesting, because first you are bringing those suppliers to access better markets and through implementing better practice, but also the one of the immediate effects that you see is that some of the steps you have to take is about addressing the impacts you generated in the past. So
Hmm.
it requires farmers to, as I mentioned, recover their legal reserves, repair an areas. They need to be able to be profitable. They need to restore the pastures. So it also has an immediate positive effect on environment.
That's great. So, as we talked about earlier, the fund is really premised on getting companies involved to finance the work that needs to happen on the ground to make leather supply chains more sustainable. And when I say companies, I think we're talking about companies that, could be a fashion company that makes leather purses or a furniture company that makes leather chairs and couches. There's a lot of different companies that make a lot of different leather products. What's your pitch to those companies about why they should contribute to this fund, and how can they make a contribution if they're interested?
Good question, and you mentioned a point that I forgot to talk about before. You're right. We are planning to work with companies in the fashion, in the footwear sector, furniture, but also we are looking at automotive companies. They
Hmm.
use a lot of leathers in their interiors, and we are looking also to engage some companies from the food sector. The
Hmm.
the main goal is leather companies, but we welcome companies in the food beef sector to engage with us. In terms of why they should engage with the fund, as I mentioned before, they even though in one side they are large international companies there, on the retailer brand side, when you start looking at the upstream side, producers, slaughterhouses, they represent a small part of that supply chain. So it's limited. The improvements they can get individually is limited, but
Hmm.
if we are able to get a large number of companies working together, we can we can build efficiencies, synergies in having those companies working together. Not only that, we see there are companies trying to do things. They have climate commitments. They have commitments to biodiversity. They believe they need to help their supply chains. But very often, when you look a brand either on fashion, automotive, or furniture, they are very far from where those environmental impacts are happening. They are very far from farmers, and it's challenging for those companies to understand where they can be more efficient in supporting those companies, how they can be meaningful in supporting those suppliers. So the
Yeah.
idea that it's not only we are able to have better, more meaningful results by supporting those suppliers together, but we are able to help those companies by engaging them with meaningful projects that have already been tested, projects that are ready to be scaled. Very often we see that there are pilots, things that you can do at small scale, but getting like a larger volumes is challenging. So we want to support those companies to be more meaningful in transforming their supply chains.
Yeah. I think that's a great pitch, and I hope that any company representatives listening to this find it compelling and want to get involved. Before I let you go, just knowing that a number of our listeners may just be regular folks who don't work for a leather supply chain company, but might still feel motivated to make a difference on sustainable leather products. Is there anything that everyday consumers can do to make a difference in this work?
That there are a lot of things they can do, and sometimes I think consumers they don't engage as much as they could because they are afraid they don't know what to ask.
Yeah,
And sometimes it's not about asking the best questions, but it's about showing you care, and it's about showing you are engaged. So I would say engage with the companies from which you are buying your products, your goods, and ask them questions. Ask where the materials are coming from, if they understand that, if those materials are not involved with deforestation, how they can prove that, and any other questions that you may have in mind. It may not be the most correct question, but just showing that you are engaged, that you want to know, you're gonna get them thinking, and you're gonna get them understanding that consumers care about more responsible, better supply chains.
yeah, I like that notion of just making the effort really can make a difference and get minds thinking about what factors they need to be considering. So
Yeah.
just raising the profile and getting people thinking about it is good.
Yeah, and the last thing, Seth, about this question, it's not hard to ask those questions. You can ask them on social medias. You have contact forms on websites. You when you are in a store, ask the person selling to you, helping you, where does this leather comes from? Is
Yeah,
it deforestation free? That information is transferred, it's channeled to their headquarters. So if you have many people asking those questions, you start moving those companies faster.
those are great examples, and thank you for giving that. That's very good low hanging fruit of send a social media message to some of the companies you buy from, or fill out their web form. That's something that all of us can do pretty easily. So, Fernando, thank you so much for walking us through this. Congratulations on launching this fund, and we really wish you the best of luck in getting it moving and really driving a lot of impact through it. And maybe 6 or 12 months from now, we can have you back on to talk about what some of the results have looked like and what you've been able to accomplish.
Sounds great. I would like thank you for the invitation. It's been a very interesting conversation, and I look forward to continuing it.
Great. Fernando, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Fernando for joining the show today. At WWF, our work with companies to make supply chains more sustainable is a big priority because the materials that go into so many products are often sourced from critical ecosystems that support biodiversity and a healthy planet. Leather is certainly a prime example of that, and I appreciate Fernando's work to drive progress in that sector. If you're a company that wants to get involved in this work, please visit WWF's Deforestation Free Leather Fund website to learn how you can do so. I'll include the link in the show notes for this episode. And for all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And together, let's keep building a more sustainable future.